G'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to share with you my initial impressions after using the Sony A7 Mark IV and the Sony 200-600 in the field for quite a few months. I want to share with you what I absolutely love, the features I like, and I also want to share what I don't like and what I've struggled with. Now, if you're new to the channel, I am a Canon shooter. I've shot Canon for the last 12 years and I'm very happy with Canon. I'm very familiar with it. So I'm going to be talking about the Sony system from a Canon shooter's perspective, and I will be sharing lots and lots of photos because that's what I do. I love going out in the field and testing this gear. So let's start off with the positive first and what I really like. The first feature I absolutely love, and I was happy to see it on the Sony, is we get zebras in stills mode on the Sony bodies. Now, some of you are probably going, zebras? What are zebras? I'll explain exactly what that is if you're not sure what zebras are. The easiest way is if I just get Gary the Galah and show you. So our goal when taking a shot is to get the correct exposure. We don't want it too bright or we don't want it too dark. At the moment, Gary's got a very good exposure. Keep an eye on the brightest parts of the image around the head of the bird. Look for what happens when I make it really bright. Can you see those white and black bars coming up on the screen? Those are our zebras. They come up when any part of our image gets too bright or overexposed. The camera's telling us that parts of our image are going to be blown or too bright. And this is amazing. It's a wonderful tool in our EVF that just tells us when the image is too bright. So once we see the zebras, what do? Well, we just make the image darker until the zebras disappear. So we can either lower that ISO or increase that shutter speed. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. And you can see that the zebras disappear. So having the zebra overlay just makes it very difficult to overexpose your shot. As soon as you see the zebras, just turn it down. And I use this in the field with this black wing stilt. It's a white bird in a dark surrounding, making exposure very difficult. If you were in auto exposure mode, the camera would have a tendency to make this way too bright, blow the whites. However, with zebras, I can easily see that the bird was too bright, so I've made the raw file quite dark to preserve the whites, and the zebras enabled me to do that. So on the Sony body, we just go into the pink auto exposure menu item down to zebra display number 7. We make sure the zebra display is on. We go down to zebra level and we go down to custom, and we just select lower limit 107 plus. The reason it's 107 plus is that's the most accurate raw file interpretation. So that's what I picked up when I looked online, and that's what I'm using, and it seems to be working fine. All right, so if you own one of these Sony bodies, I highly encourage you to give it a go. Some people don't like it because they find it a little bit distracting. That's fine. I personally like it. Now, if you have the Canon bodies, unfortunately, we don't have access to them in stills mode, which is a real bummer. However, we do have them in video mode. So if you're shooting video, put the zebras on and they will help. Why we don't have it in stills? Anyone's guess. Canon, give us zebras in stills, please. So the second feature I've been very impressed with the Sony body is bird in flight. The very first time I tried bird in flight, I was impressed with how it just tracked the bird through the sky. So on these Sony bodies, you've got loads of different autofocus options, which I'll chat about later, which can be very confusing. However, it has a wide area tracking mode, which is really good, and it just tracks the bird. So I enabled wide area tracking, and to demonstrate exactly how good it is for bird in flight, I've gone to my favorite wetland, the Winton wetlands, got there nice and early, and I had a vision. I wanted to capture a bird flying, a silhouette, like a backlit bird with the sun rising behind. So a nice orangey bright background, silhouette bird. I thought that would be really cool. So I've got there really early. We had the bright colors, everything was set up. We had lots of birds. I've had to dial in my shutter speed, which was 1/800th, which is pretty slow for bird in flights. We didn't have a lot of light. I was shooting wide open at 6.3, which gave us an ISO of around 16,000 to 25,000. So we didn't have a lot of light. I was really pushing the limits of the camera, but I wanted to try to get this image. So I've got my settings in place. I've got tracking enabled, wide area, and I've simply spotted the bird, camera up, and I've held down the button. What I would often do is start a little bit wider focal length, so say 200 or 300, because the camera can pick up the bird easier, and then zoom into 600 as the bird's flying. And as soon as I locked on, the camera's locked on, even in that low light. And you can see in this viewfinder footage, the bird is flying behind trees, but the camera is sticking to it. It was just incredible, and I was very impressed. Now, trying to get good shots was a lot more difficult than I anticipated, because you had to try and get the exact right pose with a backlit. But luckily enough, we had a heron coming into land. It's extended its wings, its feet were down, and we managed to get this silhouette shot, which I was very happy with. Check out that ISO, 16,000, which is pretty high. However, I used DxO Pure Raw 2, I think it was, to remove a lot of that noise, and it worked really well. Now, I hadn't given up. I still wanted to get another shot, and it actually wasn't until I got home that I realized the shot I'd got, and boy was I surprised. This is always a bonus. When you get home, you're looking through your images and you go, oh, I didn't even realize I took that. And I'll share the image with you now, and I'd love to hear what your reaction was in the comments. Here it is. What do you think's going on here? We've got two birds. We've clearly got a heron flying directly at that cockatoo, and it almost looks like they're about to have some sort of collision. But what actually happened was I tracked the heron, I saw it flying, I've picked it up, and we've tracked it. The cockatoo was already on the branch, and the heron's actually flown in front of the cockatoo. And I didn't even realize it had happened, and I did actually capture the viewfinder footage, and we can see the bird flying past the cockatoo, and it just happened like that. But because we're shooting in 10 frames per second, we managed to pick it up. Now you will notice that the raw file looked a lot different to that image that I showed you, especially the color. And that was just purely my preference. So when I edit images, I often edit them for what I like. So I warmed up that image a lot, made the background a lot more warm and colorful, because that's what I like. However, it wasn't really like that. And I know some of you will disagree with that. It's completely fine. You can edit the image however you like. That's how I like it. So that's what I've done. But overall, I was stoked to capture that image and have been very impressed with the bird in flight so far with this camera. All right, the next thing that I love about this kit is clearly this lens. This 200 to 600, for its price, amazing value. It gives us a zoom range of 200 millimeters to 600 millimeters. Now, 200 millimeters for me is a little bit narrow. I'd much rather the 100, say of the 100 to 500. However, 200 to 600 is what we have. And that is a good zoom range. The long end, the 600, obviously makes the subject much bigger, which is what a lot of us want when it comes to small birds, small mammals, etc. So I've gone out into the field and made the most of that 600 millimeters. And I was very fortunate to spot a turbo chook. They're not called turbo chooks. Their real name is a black-tailed native hen. However, when you get a group of them and you approach them, they just take off, like they hit the turbo and they're gone. Luckily for me though, I found one bird and its turbo was broken. It didn't seem to mind me too much. It didn't let me get that close, but because I had 600 millimeters, I've tracked the bird as it's wandering through the reeds, and we captured this shot, which I was really happy with. I love the color of that eye. I like the extra habitat in this shot, and that 600 millimeters allowed me to do it. Now you will notice I actually shot that at 582 millimeters, which was my mistake, but it sometimes happens, you knock the zoom ring occasionally, and I've taken quite a few at 582, which is a bit annoying. And what I would like, and I don't think this lens has it, but I would like a lock feature so you could lock the focal length. So while 600 millimeters sounds like a lot, on a full frame body, it's still not that much focal length, and I would always prefer a little bit more. If you think about an APS-C body like the R7, the 90D, etc., if we put a 400 millimeter lens on that, we get a field of view of 640, which is actually more field of view than we get with this lens. The good thing is with the Sony body, and I've actually got it on now, you can add a 1.4 extender. If we put that on there, this lens then becomes a 280 to 840 f9. We lose one stop of light, so it gets a little bit slower at f9, but 840 millimeters is a lot more. Now we do lose a little bit of IQ, and I'll do some tests for the review I'll do in the future, but I have used the extender and to good effect. So I've whacked on the extender and I've gone into the field to try it out. And the first bird I spotted was actually a little white-fronted chat. Now unfortunately I couldn't get close even with 840 millimeters, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this. However, I still made the most of the situation. I've framed up the bird, I've focused on it, and we have that habitat shot now. So I'd finished with the white-fronted chat, and I spotted an Australian crake. And I haven't seen this bird for quite a while, and I was so excited to photograph it. But luckily for me, I noticed in the viewfinder as I was checking out the crake that my percentage had dropped down to about 10%. And in the top right-hand corner on the Sony bodies, we get a percentage. On Canon, we get a bar, like 4 bars. I much prefer the percentage of the Sony body because I know how much I've got left, like your phone, I guess, and I knew I had to change the battery. What happens on the Canon bodies is it's like a fuel tank. You're looking at it and you go, oh yeah, I've got 2 bars left, and you think, oh, that's 50%, that's heaps. But in fact, it's not always the case. You can check the percentage by going into the menu, and I only had 21% battery left and it still showed 2 bars. So it's a little bit confusing at times, and often what happens, and it's happened to me numerous times, is the battery just dies on the Canon because I wasn't aware I was running out of battery. Now you can still do it with the Sony, but I prefer the percentage. What I would love, and I'm not sure why these camera manufacturers don't do it, is just give us a warning like on our phone. If it drops under 20% or 10%, some sort of visual indication that your battery is very low. So that could definitely be improved. But yeah, I love the percentage indicator. So I've changed the battery, and the battery did last me about 3 hours roughly. So it's coming towards the end of my session when I had to change the battery. Walked around to photograph this crake. I've got myself into position and I started photographing it with the 840mm, getting these really cool shots. And unbelievably, this bird did not care, and it was probably because I was laying down low, as I've suggested numerous times, and the bird just kept coming at me and coming at me, and it came almost too close to me. But I still had the zoom, so I've actually zoomed all the way to 280mm. I would have loved to be wider, but that enabled me to get this shot of the bird in the reeds, and this is probably my favourite crake shot of the day. I love the habitat, I love the darkness, the bird looking at us, and I would have missed this shot on a prime lens. If I'd been shooting on my big 500mm lens, there's no way I would have got this shot. So the zoom has definitely benefited in this scenario, and I was able to get that shot. So another weakness that I've definitely noticed with this kit is the minimum focus distance of 2.4 meters. It just means you can't really use it as a macro and get really close. Whereas this Canon 100-500, I think it's 0.9, which means we have heaps of magnification, and you can take butterflies and insects and get really close. So that's a big advantage of this kit that this one is lacking. It's not to say you can't. I've definitely photographed some bees, so you can still do it. You just don't quite have the magnification that you get with the Canon system. Okay, the next feature which blew me away with the Sony bodies is how customizable they are. They have so many buttons and dials, it's just, I hardly know what to do with them all. However, it's great to have them. My big complaint with the Canon R7 was we only got 2 dials. If you shoot manual, you ideally want one for ISO, shutter speed and aperture. The Sony gives us 4 dials, so we get one for every input and exposure compensation. So you're not short of any dials whatsoever. You can pretty much assign whatever function you want to any of these buttons. And something I really love, and I don't know why Canon don't do this, is on the back we have a control wheel, as we do on the R5 and the R6. But the beauty with the Sony is they've actually got 4 buttons, so top, bottom, left and right. And so we can have 4 different buttons all customized however we want, plus the control ring. Like, how good's that? And we obviously have the button in the middle. So just this dial gives us 4 extra buttons and the one in the middle. Whereas on Canon, we have the rear dial, but all it does is a rear dial. It doesn't have any buttons. So again, a brilliant design that Sony have got that Canon definitely need to initiate, because it's just great to have all those different options. One of the downsides of all the buttons and dials is just setting up the camera. It was so confusing for me to set it up. Now, I asked many of you how you have your body set up, and you suggested quite a few different YouTubers. I think Mark Smith and Steve Perry off the top of my head. I've gone and watched a number of different videos from different content creators, and they were all different. They all had different autofocus, they all had different buttons, so I'm thinking, oh, which one's the right one? And ultimately it's just, I have to try them all myself to get a system that works for me, and that was a real struggle, to be fair. I just didn't know exactly how to set it up. I've ended up going with Steve Perry's. I'll put a link on how he has his Sony body set up, and that seems to be working for me so far. Alright, so I'll share a massive fail with you. I had a pair of galahs, the most beautiful pink and grey birds we get here in Australia, and I've initiated the autofocus with eye tracking to photograph these birds, and the eye tracking wasn't working, and I was thinking, why is it not working? This is odd. And I checked the eye tracking, it says animals, and I think that's right, that's birds, and it just wouldn't work. And it dawned on me a little bit later, I figured it out. On the Canon bodies, to get bird eye AF to work, we have to set it to animals. So if we set it to animals, it picks up birds and animals and different things. So that's how it works on Canon. It does not work like that on Sony, and I figured out that later. They've actually gone one step further. You've got to select bird, which makes sense. You've got to select bird eye AF for it to track birds. If it's on animals, it won't pick up birds. So I was in this animal mode wondering why the eye tracking wasn't working. It was all my fault. But it's just one of those things. When you use 2 systems, it can get very confusing because they use different terminology and slightly different settings, etc. Overwhelming for somebody old like me. But you know, I managed to figure that out. I've now got it on bird, so it does track those birds. But that was just one of many different fails I've had setting up the Sony body. And one other thing I should really mention is, unfortunately, the Sony body, for whatever reason, is just not very comfortable in my hands. The ergonomics of the body, it actually hurts me after using it in the field. So what happens is when I put my hand on the camera, To access the back button, because I use back button focus and obviously the front button, the bottom edge of the camera digs into the palm of my hand as I'm gripping it. And after about 2 or 3 hours, I was in a lot of pain, and I've actually got a clip here showing you how red and inflamed my palm was after using this body in the field for a few hours. Now, I'm sure that would callus up over time, but I shouldn't be in that much pain from just holding a camera, but unfortunately that's just the way it is. And I also had to get used to the front button system. So on Sony, the front dial is at the front, and then we have the button, and on Canon, of course, they've got it completely round the other way. So we get the button at the front and then the dial on top. And I'm so used to this, and I'm very quick to do this. So changing to Sony, my finger just didn't know where to go. And I find it quite awkward to use the front dial and the button on top. I much prefer Canon because I'm used to that. But that's just one of many different things that I've struggled with jumping between two bodies, which is to be expected. But it's just the design. I could get a grip, I guess, but that would make it much heavier and much bigger. I guess I've just got to put up with that pain in my hand using this body, and hopefully over time it'll be less of an issue for me. But I thought it'd be worth sharing because I know a number of people do find the Sony bodies a little bit square and a little bit harsh on the edges, and that's definitely a case for me. The menu, I could go on about the menu. It's just going to take me some time to get used to. It's hard to find all the different settings, and there's been a few times where I've changed something and then struggled to figure out how to change it back, but it's just one of those things. The next feature, I didn't even know it existed on other bodies because I've only used Canon, and it's absolutely amazing. When you shoot with Sony, Fuji and other brands, you have a high frame rate. So on this camera, it's 10 frames per second. If I was using an SD card, we can only shoot at 10 frames per second for 5 seconds. So let's say I'm tracking a bird, I'm at 10 frames per second, I'm holding down the button, and then I hit the buffer. So I can't take any more shots. On Canon, you wouldn't be able to take any more photos. It would just stop, and you wouldn't be able to take another photo until the buffer was cleared. But Sony and other brands have overcome this. What happens is the frame rate just drops to a frame rate which it can shoot for unlimited. And on this one, I think it drops to 5 or 6 frames per second. So I'm shooting at 10 frames per second, and then drops to 5, but I can keep taking photos. It's not going to stop. I can take photos forever just at a lower frame rate. And that is brilliant, because that means I'm not going to miss those shots. Why Canon doesn't have it, I have no idea. So this R5 can shoot at 20 frames per second, but if I'm tracking a bird 20 frames per second, I hit the buffer, I hold down the button, and it just does nothing. It doesn't take any photos until it's cleared the buffer to then continue shooting at 20. This has a CF Express B card, which is super fast. This camera should be able to shoot at, I don't know, 10 or 15 frames per second unlimited. So Canon, just drop the frame rate like Sony and Fuji do. It would help us immensely to have that feature. So I love that. Now, in saying that, 10 frames per second is extremely slow, and it's very annoying why they've crippled the camera. This has a CF Express A card, which is unique to Sony, so it can definitely take more than 10. The Sony A1 uses the same memory card, and that can do, I think, 30 frames per second. So they've clearly crippled this on purpose to 10, which is just too slow in today's age. I think the new Canon R8 can do 40, the R7 does 30, R6 does 40. These other bodies can do much higher frame rates. So Sony, you definitely need to upgrade that on your future cameras, because whilst 10 is okay, and I've definitely had no issues, 20 or more is always better, or just give us the option so we can choose ourselves. And you know, I still took this shot of a cockatoo jumping off a tree at 10 frames per second and managed to freeze the action, and I love this shot. And we also got that other shot with the heron flying into the cockatoo. So 10 frames per second is still plenty, however I would have preferred more. Now, in regards to the image quality from this camera, no problem whatsoever. It features a 33 megapixel full frame sensor, which is probably a little bit low compared to the R5 and the A7R5. I think that's right. However, 33 is still pretty sweet, and I think it's more than adequate. It's definitely a jump up from the 24 megapixels we get on the R6 Mark II. So 33 for me is pretty good. Sony have extremely good shadow recovery and highlight recovery, and I can share a photo with you. This is the final image of a yellow-footed antechinus. Such a cute little marsupial here in Australia, similar to a mouse, but they're native. And this image came up really well. However, when I show you the raw file, you'll see how much I had to lift the shadows and reduce the highlights. So here's the raw image, and then you can see as I transition to the final image. And that was all the sensor just allowing us all that headroom, I guess. And that's one feature of Sony that I'm very impressed with, is the headroom we get when it comes to editing the files. So a great success. And another image which highlights the sensor was this young Australasian grebe. It was in the reeds. I like how it's framed, but I was a little bit bright when I took the image, but I can definitely, through editing, I can darken it and I can recover it, and it results in this really nice image. And I love this image, and it was taken with this beautiful sensor. So one concern I had about this camera was the rolling shutter, because it doesn't have a stacked sensor, and the sensor readout is a little bit slow. It's 26.8 milliseconds, which if you have a look on this chart, it's definitely slower than the R6 II, the R5, etc., but a little bit faster than some of the older Sony bodies. But to be honest, I haven't really had that many issues. So I've photographed birds in flight, I've photographed swimming birds. However, it is still there, and you can kind of see that the trees are a little bit bent in this shot of a cockatoo that was flying through the trees. So it's definitely there. So for me, it's not a huge issue. If we're doing fast things, go into mechanical, but I shot in electronic nearly all the time and managed to get all of these photos in electronic mode, which is good. And just a couple of other little things about the Sony. The A7 IV does not have an Audible Shutter, which is a bit of a bummer. The R5 doesn't have it either, but Canon's more recent bodies, the R6 II, the R7, etc., give us an Audible Shutter. The Sony A1 has it, so they've clearly omitted it, or they've crippled this for whatever reason. I love having the Audible Shutter, even on low volume, so we're getting some sort of feedback. Overall, I've had a great time with Sony, and if you're not aware, I actually have purchased this myself, and I use both systems. So I'm not switching between Canon and Sony, I have both. Due to the unexpected success of this channel, I'm able to actually use both kits, and I will use them for different things in videos going forward, and it's great to be able to use Sony and understand it, so it'll help many of you. I'm going to continue using it before I do the full review, but so far, it has its pros, it has its cons, as any system does. There's not one perfect camera, there's not one perfect lens, and ultimately you can get good shots with whatever camera you're using. But I'm having fun. Hopefully you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments what you like about your system, what you don't like. What have I missed about the Sony? What do you love about Sony, or what don't you like about Sony? And I'll continue to implement those things and try things going forward. But I'll definitely continue using Canon as well. And quickly, I just want to thank all the new members that have joined the channel. If you're not aware, for the price of less than a cup of coffee, you can directly support me, and it really helps me continue making content. You get a great little bird emoji next to your name to indicate you're a member, and you get access to the 2023 digital download calendar for free with your membership. It's high 4K, works on your laptop, your PC, or your tablet, and we've got a great community. Get down to those comments, read those comments. I read them all. I might not be able to answer them all, but I love the community that we've built. So happy birding, take care, we'll see you in the next one. See you later.